Wisdom, a show in which we seek to understand the many ideas, religious and secular, that unite us. I am your host, Tyler. This is the first episode, The Role of Myth. So, question that I've thought a lot about, um, and my view of it has, definitely adjusted over the years. But it's what makes us as humans unique within the animal kingdom. I think there's so much to unpack here, and that's probably kind of our, self-serving side as people. We learn about other life and different things like that. But man, when it comes to ourselves, we've got a lot we can talk about. So I was raised with the idea that humans were created as something separate from the animal kingdom, that we were superior to all other life, and as a result, that the God who created us intended for us to have dominion over the earth. Now, anyone who has grown up in any of the Judeo Christian cultures, which, you know, very much entails Western society in most senses, anyways, you'll be familiar with this idea. But if we strip that all away, now that so we do things. It's interesting. We do things. We don't really know why we do things. There's so many things in Western society. People that claim to be non-religious, they still have things they do that are very much based out of some of these assumptions that we've all grown up with. So it's a lot of work to do this, but if we are able to strip that all away, um, the question of what makes us humans, or what makes humans unique, takes on a bit of a different tone. So, really the question, a big question that comes along with that is, how did we become one of the most effective species on Earth? And, there'll be arguments as to what that means is effective, because we can sure screw things up too. But we've been very successful as far as populating the Earth, um, you know, dominating it in a sense to our will. But we're animals, and we're not particularly big, imposing. We aren't the quickest. We're not the most agile. Can't really climb trees as well as our ancestors. We don't have the biggest teeth or claws. We don't have a particularly tough hide. We don't really have like insulation. You think of bears, or different Arctic animals are able to survive in pretty extreme environments. We don't have anything like that. Um, so what you'll often hear as an answer to that question is that our success is due to our large brains, uh, or comparatively large brains. But what exactly does that mean? I mean, we've all known some pretty smart people, exceptionally intelligent people who, despite all that intellect, they wouldn't last half a second in a fist fight. So, our brain in and of itself is not what sets us apart so much as it as certain um, activities that our brain allows us to do. And what I'm referring to here is, it's our ability, because of our brains, we're able to cooperate in groups. And it's this group cooperation that has allowed us to be so proficient as a species. Think about it. Working in groups requires coordination between different individuals. It requires, you can't coordinate without communication, and you can't communicate without abstract thinking. So this is how I see, they talk about our brains making us unique. This is really where it comes into play, is this abstract thinking. We can ponder on things like life and death. We can make plans. Um, so, I mean, the idea of abstract thinking, it's the ability to visualize something that isn't immediately and physically immediately in front of us. Now, we can see other animals that have some level of this memory, I would say plays a part in that. And we've heard of different animals um, migrating, returning to the same areas year after year, despite traveling hundreds of miles away. They can find their way back. The elephants, I believe, can remember where certain watering holes are during certain parts of the season. So we're not the only ones who have that ability, but the extent to which we can apply it is extremely unique. So, I mean, think about it. Time is an absolutely abstract concept. Time, you know, it's all conceptual. Outside of the now, it's all conceptual, and that's a concept I'd really like to come back to later in one of the episodes. But time is abstract. Plans are abstract. You write out plans for something that you're going to do in the future. You make assignments to different people who are going to do these different things in the future in coordination with each other. That's all abstract thinking. Now, this, allowed our ancestors to coordinate hunting parties and social hierarchies. It's what allowed us to invent language. Language is purely abstract. Think about it. If if it was naturally intuitive, you would never have a problem understanding any language. And in fact, really, if it was completely intuitive, would there be more than one language? Um, so abstract thinking also allowed us to make clothing and tools out of the materials in our environment, which would allow us to spread out to different parts of the world that our, physical, frail bodies otherwise wouldn't be able to survive in. We'd all be living on the, much nearer the equator and never have gone beyond that. So I did mention that the episode is um, the role of myth. So you might be wondering, where does myth come into all this? Well, first of all, myth it completely relies on abstract thinking. I think if you think the context of the word myth, um, or the word myth, we'll just say, often will conjure up images of like the ancient Greek pantheon with gods like Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite, um, or the ancient Norse myths with Odin and Thor and Loki, um, different things like that. But so, anyways, my point is, it's not uncommon when you hear the word myth to think of it exclusively in reference to ancient belief systems. Um, but myth, in fact, is much broader of a concept that includes any type of story that is intended to communicate cultural values. So this kind of broadens it out. I think well beyond those who haven't taken too much time to think about it. What they would think of. But it really is a story intended to communicate those cultural values. So we've talked about, I've kind of referenced the Greek and the Norse gods, the pantheon. Um, but then this can expand out to fairy tales, right? Doesn't feel like much of a difference. But fairy tales that were very common in Europe Um, you got, these creatures like sprites and dwarves, changelings, and, lots of other odd little magical creatures. Um, but then you expand it out from that and start talking about Bible, Quran, Bhagavad Gita, all these holy books um, contain myth. And now, I really don't know how many people are going to listen to this that are particularly religious, but if you are, welcome. And I want to clarify that myth does not necessarily have to entail fiction. It's not one and the same is the point I'm trying to make. So I say that because, well, I will often see people on the internet disparagingly refer to modern religions as fairy tales, as if, first of all, as if there's no inherent value in a fairy tale. Um, but I think that comes with another cultural kind of assumption that a lot of people make. Because here in the West, we have there's a few breakdowns in the way we view fairy tales. First of all, let's just say it like this. Much like overprocessing food is going to remove many of the nutrients that's in it, Disney has come in and they've overprocessed these stories. They've recreated many of them in a stripped down, a very infantilized way. It's kind of the trope of the princess and the prince and the magic beings, and everything turns out fine and dandy, and she lives happily ever after with her prince, that type of thing. But that's a far cry from the original stories that Disney has told, of which Disney has based their stories. The truth is that many folk tales and fairy tales, they were much darker, and traditionally they stood as warnings, I'd say stark warnings for children who grew up in a much more unforgiving world. I just think of, God, how many of them, involve a child going off into the woods and meeting strangers, right? Don't really think about it this way because they've Disneyfied these stories, but Hansel and Gretel, for example, don't go into the woods by yourself. Now, if you lived in a time, if you lived on the border of, a thick, dense forest in a time, I don't know, I'm picturing like um, the old, what's now Germany, back when the Black Forest was very prominent in the region. Um, People kind of lived in these small communities out on the edge of the woods. The idea of your kid wandering off into the trees and getting lost would be terrifying. And, it's easy for us to look at it from our 21st century lens and think, oh, why would you tell your kids such horrific stories? That's just, why would you do that? Why would you traumatize in that way? But the idea of, your kid getting lost in the woods, it would be worth it as a parent. It would be worth it. I mean, you need to make that clear, no questions. Like, you do not go into those woods alone. So we have stories like Hansel and Gretel going off into the woods. They meet the witch, which, you can see as a stranger in the woods. If some stranger invites you into their home, that's a scary thought as a parent. So, um, myths, folk tales, folklore, they actually serve a very useful role in society. Um, Religion itself fills a very similar role. We don't necessarily see it the same way. Folklore is more kind of localized stories, while we see religion. particularly in the 21st centuries, is these big behemoths kind of just, you know, controlling masses of people in, you know, large swaths of land. Um, but in reality, religion does fill similar roles. It teaches values, cultural norms, right? Kind of these are taboo. You don't do these. This is acceptable behavior. Um, gives warnings for many different things, um, etc. So it does this through story, right? And so we referred to these ancient texts, and they're full of stories, right? Stories of Jesus of Nazareth, or um, the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, or um, the Hindu um, gods and their interactions with humans, and all these different things. They're stories. Now, like I mentioned before, we don't need to focus on whether these stories are fictional or not. And I think that's where a lot of the problem comes in. I think that's where, well, there's a lot of reasons why people struggle with religion nowadays, and many of which I empathize with. Um, but I think we take a big risk when we just throw it all out. Um, anyway, so my point is to, like, whether it's fictional or not. First of all, if you live in the 21st century, America, or any of these English-speaking countries, or any of these Western, quote unquote, Western countries, don't disparage fairy tales. I mean, you can do what you want, obviously, but disparaging religion, kind of trying to knock it down a few rungs by calling it fairy tales because you think fairy tales are just Disney. Um, and we'll swing this right back onto Disney. If you watch superhero movies, if you watch, anything that's fiction, really, you're engaging in the same. You're engaging in the same behavior as anybody who engages in religion and these religious stories. Honestly, I mean, superheroes, well, first of all, they do things that are um, beyond the norm that any human can do, right? They got superpowers, um, and often many of them have like these overemphasized traits. That's what you're going to get if you read the Bible. Hate to break it to you, same thing. It's just in a format that's easier for us in our time to digest. That's basically the difference. Now, I'm not gonna. I want to address some of the concerns though too, because I think they are very much legitimate. Um, so first of all, like I said, this is something more palatable. Superhero movies or whatever. Lord of the Rings, whatever fictional story that you're into. It's just a more palatable version of these types of stories for us in our time. Unfortunately, many of these old texts, um, the Quran, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, all that stuff, because of the age, those come in a those were written in a time where the background was different. It was different culture, different time period, different way of life. And so many of the lessons that are in there will get lost in translation, is really what it comes down to. Um, and that's what we got to be careful with. Just assuming that the way we see things is somehow the superior way, it's almost like a cultural bias, a time, yeah, an age bias or whatever it is that we're expressing when we do that. So why does this matter? Well, I'll be the first person to tell you that you do need to be careful when it comes to these stories, even the modern stories, but let's say the older stories in particular, for a number of reasons. First of all, these older texts are just going to come with a gap in understanding because of the time difference, the culture difference, and everything. Now, because of this, that's really what most religious teachers' role is. A priest or whatever religious role it might be. That's what most of what they do is a preacher, so on. They're translating, in a sense, these old words in a way that their followers can more easily understand, and that's just fine. I mean, that's great. That's worked for generations and generations, and I think that will not be something that ever ends in the history of humanity. But like with anything else out there, anywhere somebody sees an opening for influence or power over other people, you're going to get those people who can't handle it. They want to abuse it. And they try to use that role sometimes in order to convince their followers that they're supposed to do something that really is messed up and shouldn't be done. So I know a lot of people, they're kind of their trigger with religion. It's the abusive leaders that unfortunately happen on occasion. But don't confuse that with the actual teachings, because it's really easy for somebody to take an old text and twist the meaning of it for an audience that's not familiar with all of the context and the background of the original text. It's way too easy for them. So beware, as the Bible says, beware of false prophets. So that takes me to the next thing about why you need to be careful. Taking ancient texts and even modern texts, honestly, too literally, it can be very problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, context is everything. Different culture, different time, different understanding of the world is going to affect the way these words are understood. Also, it's easy to misinterpret something that's not just old, but that's been translated over and over again. Translation. So I speak two different languages. Well, three, kind of. But I'll just say, with as much my familiarity of it, translation between languages is extremely tricky in and of itself, because certain things, idioms and things like that, they don't translate directly. So when somebody is translating between two different languages, sometimes they have to take some liberties to try to get the message across, and it's never going to be a precise, direct message change because languages are different from each other. So that translation is going to be tricky in and of itself. But on top of that, every translator is going to have a bias as well, which is going to play into the way they translate those differences. And it's not unrealistic for the current version of an old text or even a new text that's been translated once to look very different from the original meaning. And sometimes you can't really read the intent that somebody wrote something with initially, so that the understanding of the original text may also be lost too. So anyways, my point being, translation is tricky. Translation over millennia, don't take it too literally, because there's like a 98% chance that you're understanding something very different from the original writing. That being said, if you can learn a valuable lesson from a person or from an entire movement that's already learned it, instead of having to learn the hard way that lesson, why wouldn't you? While many cultures, languages, and worldviews have come and gone, there are some lessons that they just continually resurface. They pop up over and over again. And they kind of, to kind of use a Buddhist imagery, so you think of the lotus flower, it has to find its way through the mud to get to the surface of the water to bloom. Going through these old religious ideas and texts, it can be very muddy. But there are certain things that do make it through the mud time and time and time again. And it's independent of the religion, the basic ideologies, it's independent of the dogmas that may come with it. But these ideas, some of these ideas will resurface over and over again. And because of that, my goal of this podcast is to discuss those ideas that just appear to hold strong throughout all of these ages and different things. I believe those ideas are the most valuable nuggets of wisdom that religion has to offer. And I think if we as a society don't discard them, but apply them, then we will benefit as a whole. So I guess you could say my goal is to not allow these ageless values to get thrown out in the name of anti-religion or science or whatever it may be that's getting in the way. My hope is that we can pay attention to those things, that we can take it religious ideas in a more nuanced way, that we can pick out the good. I really do believe that's the best approach. And so I look forward to discussing these things, to looking into these things with you, and hopefully discovering the best nuggets of wisdom that are available to us. Thank you for listening. I'll catch up with you next time. Bye.